Harlem, 1935. The air thick with gunpowder and blood. 12 men walked into a tenement building on 139th Street with one mission: kill Bumpy Johnson. Dutch Schultz had sent his best, his most vicious, his most ruthless killers. They came armed to the teeth, Tommy guns, pistols, knives. They came to end the life of the man who dared to challenge the Bronx beer barons' reign over Harlem's numbers racket. When the sun rose the next morning, 11 bodies lay cold on those blood-soaked floors. Only one man walked out alive, and the message he carried back to Dutch Schultz would change the underworld forever. Here is the story. Picture Harlem in 1935. Not the Harlem of tourist brochures or jazz-age romance novels. The real Harlem, the one where children stepped over drunks on their way to school, where mothers barricaded their doors at night and prayed their sons would make it home alive, where the Depression had hit Black America like a sledgehammer and hope was a luxury most couldn't afford. This was Dutch Schultz's kingdom, or at least he thought it was. The Dutchman, born Arthur Flegenheimer in the Bronx, had clawed his way up from running beer during Prohibition to controlling the most lucrative illegal lottery operation in New York City, the numbers racket. Pennies and nickels from washerwomen, porters, and factory workers. It didn't sound like much, but it added up to millions, and Dutch Schultz wanted every single cent flowing through Harlem to flow through him. But there was a problem. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. They called him Bumpy. Not because of the way he walked or talked, but because of the bumps on the back of his head, scars from the street fights of his youth, battle wounds he wore like medals. By 1935, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another street hustler. He was a legend in the making. The man who stood up to the white mob. The man who protected Harlem's own. The man who refused to bow. Bumpy had arrived in Harlem from South Carolina as a teenager, running from a murder charge, carrying nothing but rage and ambition. He'd learned the streets under Stephanie St. Clair, the infamous Queen of Numbers, a black woman who'd built an empire when women weren't supposed to build anything at all. She taught him the game, the money, the power, and most importantly, she taught him this: never, ever bow to anyone. So when Dutch Schultz started muzzling in on Harlem's numbers operation, using violence and intimidation to force black operators out of business, Bumpy didn't negotiate. He didn't compromise. He went to war. The streets of Harlem became a battlefield. Dutch's enforcers would shake down a numbers runner. The next day, that enforcer would be found in an alley with a bullet in his skull. Dutch would firebomb a policy bank. Bumpy would retaliate by hitting 3 of Dutch's locations in one night. Back and forth, blood for blood, death for death. But Dutch Schultz wasn't used to resistance, especially not from a black man in Harlem. In his mind, this was his territory, his money. And Bumpy Johnson was nothing more than an uppity problem that needed to be erased. So he made a decision. No more half measures, no more warning. He was going to send a message that would echo through every street corner in Harlem. He was going to kill Bumpy Johnson in the most public, most brutal way possible. He assembled a death squad, 12 men, the best killers in his organization, veterans of gang wars and mob hits. Men who'd gunned down rivals in broad daylight and slept like babies afterward. Men with no conscience, no mercy, no soul. The order was simple. Find Bumpy Johnson, kill him, leave the body where everyone could see it, and make sure Harlem knew who was boss. The word came to Bumpy through the grapevine. Dutch had put a price on his head, $50,000. Dead only, no negotiation, no surrender, just death. Most men would have run, fled to Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, anywhere but Harlem. Most men would have understood they were outgunned, outmanned, outfinanced. Dutch Schultz had connections to the Italian mob, corrupt cops on his payroll, and unlimited resources. Bumpy Johnson had his reputation, his crew, and his pride. But Bumpy wasn't most men. He knew they were coming. His network of lookouts, runners, and informants had eyes everywhere. He knew Dutch's men had been asking questions, canvassing the neighborhood, mapping out his movements. They were hunting him patiently, methodically, like wolves circling wounded prey. But here's what Dutch Schultz didn't understand about Bumpy Johnson. The man wasn't prey. He was the apex predator. Bumpy could have hidden, could have fortified himself in some safe house with armed guards and waited it out. But that's not how Bumpy operated. Running meant weakness. Hiding meant fear. And fear was a currency Bumpy Johnson refused to trade in. Instead, he did something that seemed like madness. He stayed visible. He walked the streets of Harlem like he owned them. He sat in his usual spots, ate at his regular restaurants, conducted business in plain sight. He wanted Dutch's men to find him. Because Bumpy had a plan, he spread the word through specific channels, let it be known he'd be at a certain tenement building on 139th Street, a place he used for meetings, a place with multiple exits, narrow staircases, and thick walls, a place where 12 men with guns would find their advantage turned into a death trap. Bumpy handpicked his crew, not the biggest men, not the loudest, but the smartest, the calmest under fire, men who understood that gunfights weren't won by whoever shot first, but by whoever thought clearest. They prepared that tenement like it was Thermopylae. Every angle calculated, every exit covered, every shadow weaponized. They didn't have more guns than Dutch's men, but they had something better. They had home field advantage, they had desperation, and they had Bumpy Johnson. Quick question. Have you ever had a moment where you knew violence was coming, but you had to stand your ground anyway? Where running meant losing everything you'd built, everything you were? Let us know in the comments. The night before the hit, Bumpy gathered his men, 5 of them, against 12. He looked each one in the eye and told them the truth. Some of you might not make it out of this. Some of you might die tomorrow. But if we run, we're already dead. Harlem is watching. If we bow to Dutch Schultz, every white mobster in New York will think they can take what's ours. We don't fight for ourselves tomorrow. We fight for every black man and woman in this city who's been told to bow down. They didn't sleep that night. They prayed. They wrote letters to loved ones. They made peace with whatever God would have them. And they waited. The intelligence came in around 3 a.m. Dutch's men were mobilizing. They'd been drinking, working themselves up for the kill. They were coming at dawn, when the streets would be empty, when witnesses would be few. Bumpy didn't flinch. He checked his weapons, a .45 pistol, a sawed-off shotgun, and the most dangerous weapon of all, his mind. He positioned his men throughout the building, 1 on the roof, 2 covering the stairwells, 1 watching the back exit, and Bumpy himself, waiting in the 3rd-floor room where he'd let it be known he'd be sleeping. The trap was set. Now came the hardest part, the waiting, the silence before the storm, the minutes that felt like hours, where every creak of the building sounded like approaching death. And then, just as the first light of dawn touched the Harlem skyline, they heard it, the sound of car doors closing, footsteps, minute, whispered voices, the metallic click of weapons being readied. Dutch Schultz's death squad had arrived. They came in quiet, professionals, 12 men moving through the pre-dawn darkness like shadows. They'd done this before, kicked indoors, murdered men in their sleep. This was supposed to be easy money. Find Bumpy Johnson, put bullets in him, collect the bounty. But the moment they entered that building, they entered Bumpy's world. The first 2 men died on the staircase, never even saw it coming. Bumpy's man on the 2nd-floor landing waited until they passed, then opened fire from behind, 2 shotgun blasts in the narrow stairwell. The sound was deafening, the carnage immediate. Both men dropped dead before they hit the floor. The others panicked, started shooting blindly. Bullets tearing through walls, shattering windows, splintering wood. But Bumpy's men weren't there anymore. They'd moved the second they'd fired. Different positions, different angles. This wasn't a gunfight. It was a massacre. Dutch's men tried to advance up the stairs. Bumpy's man on the roof dropped a Molotov cocktail down the stairwell. Fire erupted, screaming, chaos. 3 more men engulfed in flames, running, burning, dying. The survivors tried to retreat, but Bumpy had positioned another man at the back exit. They were trapped, caught between fire and bullets in a building that had become their tomb. Bumpy himself appeared on the 3rd-floor landing, calm, silent, a pistol in each hand. He didn't rush, didn't panic. He aimed, fired, moved, aimed again. Each shot deliberate, each shot fatal. One of Dutch's men, a veteran killer named Mickey Dunn, managed to get a shot off that grazed Bumpy's shoulder. Bumpy didn't even flinch. He turned, looked Mickey dead in the eyes, and said 4 words that would become legend in Harlem. "A not today, white boy." Then he put 2 bullets in Mickey's chest. The gunfight lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The building filled with smoke, blood, and the smell of death. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was even louder than the gunfire had been. Bumpy walked through the carnage, checking bodies. 11 dead. His men had taken some injuries, nothing fatal. They'd survived. Against all odds, they'd survived. But there was 1 man still breathing, barely. a young enforcer named Tommy Sullivan. He'd taken a bullet to the gut and was bleeding out on the floor, gasping, crying, praying to a god that probably wasn't listening. Bumpy knelt down beside him, looked at this young white kid who'd come to Harlem to murder him for money. Tommy couldn't have been more than 22, probably had a mother somewhere worried sick about him, probably had dreams once before Dutch Schultz turned him into a killer. Bumpy pressed a cloth against Tommy's wound. Not hard enough to save him, but enough to slow the bleeding. Enough to buy him a few more minutes of life. "You're dying, son," Bumpy said quietly. "Nothing I can do about that. You made your choices." Tommy nodded, tears streaming down his face. He knew. "But I'm going to give you a gift," Bumpy continued. "I'm going to let you live long enough to deliver a message. You think you can do that?" Tommy nodded again, desperate, clinging to those last moments of life. Bumpy leaned in close. His voice was calm, cold, absolute. "You tell Dutch Schultz this. He sent 12 men to kill me. 11 are dead. You're dying. This is Harlem. This is my city. If he ever sends men after me again, I won't just kill them. I'll burn down every business he owns. I'll kill every man who works for him. And then I'll come for him personally. You tell him Bumpy Johnson doesn't run. Bumpy Johnson doesn't hide. And Bumpy Johnson doesn't lose. You got that? Hurry." Tommy whispered, "Yes." Good. "Now get out of here before you bleed out in my building." Bumpy's men helped Tommy down the stairs into a car and drove him close enough to Dutch's territory that his people would find him. They left him on the sidewalk, still breathing, still conscious enough to deliver the message. By the time the police arrived at the tenement on 139th Street, Bumpy and his men were long gone. The cops found 11 bodies, spent shell casings, and blood everywhere. But no witnesses, no suspects. No one in Harlem saw anything. No one heard anything, because Harlem protected its own. Tommy Sullivan died in the hospital 3 hours later, but not before he delivered Bumpy's message, word for word, to Dutch Schultz. Here's the part of the story that got buried. The part that didn't make it into the newspapers or the history books. The part that was kept secret for decades. Dutch Schultz was a psychopath, a man who'd killed without hesitation, who'd ordered murders like other people ordered coffee. But when he heard Bumpy's message, something changed. For the first time in his criminal career, Dutch Schultz was afraid. He'd sent 12 of his best men to kill one black man in Harlem, and 11 came back in coffins. The message was clear. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another street thug. He was something else entirely. Something dangerous. Sin me. Something unstoppable. Dutch called a meeting with his top lieutenants. According to sources close to the organization, sources whose testimony wouldn't surface until the 1970s during congressional hearings on organized crime, Dutch actually considered pulling out of Harlem entirely. "It's not worth it," he allegedly said. "That man is the devil himself." But Dutch's ego wouldn't let him back down completely. Instead, he did something unprecedented. He sent an intermediary to negotiate a truce, not a surrender. Not an apology, but a mutual agreement to divide Harlem's numbers racket. Dutch would control certain territories. Bumpy would control others. They'd coexist, Bumpy agreed. Not because he was afraid, but because he was smart. He knew the Italian mob would eventually back Dutch if the war continued. He knew the police would use the violence as an excuse to crack down on Harlem's black-owned businesses. And he knew that sometimes winning means knowing when to accept victory without pushing for total annihilation. But the real secret, the one that didn't come out until decades later, was what Bumpy did with Tommy Sullivan before he died. A nurse at the hospital where Tommy was taken wrote in her personal diary about a strange visitor who came to see Tommy in his final moments. A well-dressed black man who shouldn't have been able to get past hospital security, but somehow did. The man sat with Tommy for 10 minutes. They spoke quietly, and when the man left, Tommy seemed at peace. That diary wasn't discovered until 2003, when the nurse's granddaughter donated her grandmother's belongings to a historical society. In it, the nurse wrote, "The colored man who visited the dying gangster showed more compassion than anyone else. He held the boy's hand. He prayed with him. I don't know who he was, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes. Sad, weary, like a soldier who was tired of war. That man was Bumpy Johnson. He'd gone to the hospital, risking arrest, risking his life to sit with the young man he defeated, to offer whatever comfort could be offered to a dying enemy. Because despite the violence, despite the brutality, despite everything, Bumpy Johnson understood something that men like Dutch Schultz never could. Everybody had a mother. Every dead man had been somebody's son. And violence, even justified violence, carried a weight. The incident was covered up for years because it didn't fit the narrative anyone wanted to tell. The white newspapers didn't want to admit that a black man had defeated a dozen white gangsters. The mob didn't want to acknowledge that Dutch Schultz had been humiliated, and Bumpy himself never spoke about it publicly because real power doesn't need to brag. But in the streets of Harlem, the story spread like wildfire. It became legend. It became myth. It became the moment when Harlem stood up and said, "No more. We will not be victims. We will not bow. We will fight, and we will win." Bumpy Johnson would go on to become one of the most powerful figures in Harlem for the next 3 decades. He worked with the Italian mob when it suited him. He protected his community when it mattered. And he never, ever forgot where he came from. Dutch Schultz never sent men after Bumpy again. In fact, just a few months after the failed hit, Dutch himself was gunned down by the Commission, the ruling body of the Italian-American mafia, who'd grown tired of his recklessness. He died in a Newark hospital, delirious and babbling. Some say his last words included a reference to the man from Harlem who couldn't be killed. That man from Harlem lived until 1968, dying of a heart attack at 62. Thousands attended his funeral. Malcolm X had been a friend. Muhammad Ali paid his respects. Harlem mourned. But here's what makes this story matter decades later. It's not just about gangsters and gunfights. It's about a man who refused to accept the limitations that society placed on him. In an era when Black Americans were told to be grateful for scraps, Bumpy Johnson demanded respect. When he was told to bow, he stood taller. When he was told he couldn't win, he won anyway. Was he a criminal? Yes. Did he do terrible things? Absolutely. But he also protected Harlem from predators who would have bled the community dry. He employed people during the Depression. He funded black businesses when banks wouldn't. He stood as a symbol that even in the darkest times, resistance was possible. The message he sent back with that dying enforcer wasn't just for Dutch Schultz. It was for everyone who thought they could take whatever they wanted from Harlem without consequence. It was a declaration of dignity, of self-determination, of power, and it worked. So here's my question for you. In your own life, when have you had to stand your ground against impossible odds? When have you had to decide between running to safety and fighting for something bigger than yourself? When have you had to send your own message to the world about who you are and what you won't tolerate? Let us know in the comments, because these stories matter. These moments of courage, flawed, complicated, imperfect courage, they matter. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a saint, but he was a warrior, a protector, a man who understood that sometimes the only way to survive is to make sure your enemies understand you're more trouble than you're worth. And unfortunately, they don't make men like Bumpy Johnson anymore.